Hi, I'm E.M. Strickbine. I write the Green Beret Barber of Orange Street book project, which is available at www.thegreenberetbarber.com. Today I wanted to do a small reading from chapter 2 of the book project. I'm just going to read for 15 minutes, so I hope you guys enjoy. Philadelphia, September 1888. Ophelia Eufaula Hudson, the great love of Watson Sr.'s life, the sacred symbol of all he should not have but did anyway, was the last daughter of the final generation of the Pennsylvania Hudsons. She belonged to the specific world of old wealth in the Americas, which had sailed over on the Mayflower and created themselves as kings in the New World. It was an esteemed and noble world that brooked no outside influences. It was only by an exceptional instance of rare happenstance that a gruff and unseasoned orphan like Watson Sr. was ever able to penetrate the opaline gates of their illustrious world. While the Pennsylvania Hudson family could match pedigrees with any of the richest families in New York, a series of bad investments and generations of spendthrift gamblers had left the once plentiful coffers nearly empty. The family did all they could to hide that their extreme wealth had been bled dry by generations of misuse, but each year the challenge grew greater. With the money all but gone, they could barely manage to keep the holes patched in the roof of their mansion, a giant turreted affair with lush gardens that had once blanketed the landscape like a patchwork quilt of multicolored blooms. Unfortunately, the flowers had slowly been displaced by an infestation of overgrown weeds, but all that was well hidden on a private drive and behind massive iron gates. Such was the state of affairs when Watson Sr. arrived on the scene. For years and years, the Hudson family had had their hands full just trying to keep up appearances, but even with all their efforts, the cracks were beginning to show. People had begun to whisper that the family was broke, and the truth behind them carried these rumors further than they might have traveled otherwise. Worse, there were no voices to contradict these damaging whispers. Everyone knew that the great accomplishments of their forebears were long over. Only the streets and parks that still bore the family name were left to attest to their grand legacy. However, none of these produced any kind of income, and that was no secret either. During the rainiest September anyone could remember, Watson Sr. came to Philadelphia on business. He chose to stay at the finest establishment in the city, the Continental Hotel. On his first night there, he went down to the dining room and ordered a rare steak with all the fixings and a bottle of good whiskey. Sitting alone at the bar, he looked across the opulent dining room and spied Ophelia Eufaula Hudson as she dined with her family. For Watson Sr., it was love at first sight. He signaled to the maitre d' and insisted on paying the bill for the Hudsons' entire table. Watson Sr. was never afraid of anything, but when faced with young Ophelia Eufaula's ravishing beauty and elevated pedigree, he felt unexpectedly nervous. He took a couple shots of whiskey and went over to introduce himself. The Hudsons were aghast. People regularly bought their meals just for the favor of a nod and a smile. It was beyond impertinent for an uncouth stranger to actually approach them. Ophelia Eufaula's father, Abraham Charles Hudson, handled the brief exchange. As was his habit, he was haughty and curt, but he stopped short of offending the obviously well-moneyed, but very unwelcome stranger. However, before he had arrived tableside to tip his hat, Abraham Charles knew who Watson Sr. was. The maitre d' had told him before Watson Sr. was even allowed to pay the bill. In the maitre d's mind, New York City railroad magnates may come and go, but the Hudsons were forever. They were the most important people in the city, even if they did sometimes forget to pay. After all, there was always someone willing to pick up the tab on a legacy, especially if it meant being acknowledged by the family and having that acknowledgement seen by everyone who mattered. The next night was very much the same for the Hudsons. They arrived at the Continental Hotel dining room after having fled their own dining room, which had sprung one troublesome leak after another with the heavy rainfall. There were so many copper pots and pans set up to catch the dripping water that there was hardly room for anyone to sit and try and eat as the water drip-dropped a hollow metallic melody to accompany a soggy meal. Instead, the Hudsons donned their best so that they might eat in more comfortable and less despairingly noisy quarters. But just as they did not have the money for a new roof, they also did not have the money for the steaks and lobsters and bottles of fine champagne that crowded the large cherry wood tabletop at the Continental Hotel. But again, Watson Sr. spied the family and signaled to the maitre d'. Once again, his money was accepted, even though he was clearly not. Undeterred, Watson Sr. approached the table with growing anxiety. This time, he received the honor of a handshake, although Abraham Charles' quick words of thanks were uttered with a measure of tepid alkalinity. It was going to be a long journey, Watson Sr. decided. Despite having spent the equivalent of many months' wages for a common man, he still had not approached within 10 feet of Ophelia Eufaula. That night, as he prepared for bed, Watson Sr. decided on a new plan for getting within arm's reach of his prize. For the money he had spent, he could have fucked his way through every prostitute housed in the best brothel in Philadelphia. But Watson Sr. knew he could not concern himself with pennies if he really wanted to get what he wanted. So early the next day, Watson Sr. went to the bank and withdrew enough cash to fill a nondescript, multicolored, leather-handled carpet bag. Before being retooled into a piece of luggage, the bag had once been a fine Persian carpet shot through with a liberal amount of gold threads. When evening came, Watson Sr. again found the maitre d' and gave him 10 crisp $100 bills. The deal done, an hour later, Watson Sr. dressed in his best suit and took a seat not at the bar, but at the immense cherry wood table that dominated the romantically lit dining room. The night drew on, but his meal and customary bottle of whiskey were all that decorated the long, dreary white expanse of the delicate linen tablecloth. That night, the Philadelphia Hudsons never showed up at the Continental Hotel dining room, nor did they come the next night. Watson Sr. was not discouraged, though. He only saw the delay as a new call to action. Early the next morning, the raven who kept his large straw nest above the mezzanine of the Continental Hotel watched as a nondescript, middle-aged, sandy-haired man exited the hotel with an equally nondescript, leather-handled carpet bag in hand. The gold filament thread woven through the mottled oranges, reds, and yellows of the old Persian rug caught a glimmer of sunlight in a way that entranced the hotel's resident black-winged sentinel. No one else paid the nondescript man any mind as he grabbed the brass rail on a cherry-red streetcar, but the raven followed, watching the glinting shimmers from the gold threads and the polished rails. The electric streetcar traveled along its route and eventually brought the man to within a block of the Hudson's hidden compound. He looked back and forth as well as up and down the street to be sure that he had not been followed. The man dismounted when the ringing of the shiny streetcar's braking bell signaled that it was coming to a stop. The raven watched as the nondescript man approached the imposing iron gates, which appeared to be impassable, but yielded only a rusted metal lock whose aged chain broke free when the man grabbed the gate door and pulled it strongly towards him. From his perch in an untrimmed yew tree, the raven watched the nondescript man knock on the massive oak door, then speak a few words to the grizzled old butler who answered. In the next moment, the man handed the butler the gold thread carpet bag, as well as a gilt-edged envelope he had produced from within the pocket of his dark gray overcoat. The carpet bag and envelope disappeared within the house, and the man turned to walk back towards the gate. The curious raven cocked his head from left to right and back again, trying to find some glinting golden thing in the sunlight, but the shining objects that had lured him from his nest were gone. Undiscouraged, the raven took to wing. From his aerial vantage, he watched as the nondescript man made his way through the open iron gate and back out onto the tree-lined street. With no more treasures to behold, the raven quickly lost interest in the man's journey and set his mind to more urgent business, the scavenging of a long-awaited breakfast. The Hudson family would never condescend to eat leftover food, so after being home for 2 nights, the rummage bins were nearly overflowing with barely eaten food. The raven dived in, delighted by the bounty, and ate his fill of chicken and beans, steak and potatoes, vegetables, and rice. The small golden glints that caught his eye had led the raven to a great reward, so with his empty belly satisfyingly full, he flew back to his nest that evening. As the sun began to dip in the west, setting the sky ablaze in fiery shades of pink and red and orange, the raven resumed his generously padded nest, content and happy. He buried his head beneath his sable wing to enjoy a well-earned nap, while beneath his lofty perch 2 large horse-drawn carriages pulled to a stop before the palatial entrance of the Continental Hotel. The hotel's footmen opened the black lacquered carriage doors, and the Hudson family slowly emerged. The men were elegantly attired in handsome suits with thick gold pocket watch chains adorning their waistcoats. Although the watches themselves, family heirlooms all, were long gone and sold, in their place were only lumps of coal, filed down with sandpaper to resemble the shape of real watches. The women of the Hudson family were dressed in old-style, dated gowns of satin, which were draped over thick petticoats and wide hoop skirts. Ophelia Eufaula was the last to emerge in a stunning gown of royal blue that set off her startling sapphire blue eyes and long blonde curls to perfection. Led by the family patriarch, Abraham Charles, the sumptuously dressed procession entered the dining room where Watson Sr. sat waiting for them. The maitre d' had seen to it that an extra chair had been set at the head of the large cherry wood table, just for Watson Sr. The 11 members of the Hudson party took their customary seats, with the exception of Abraham Charles, who sat to Watson Sr.'s right. The two great men, one the head of an old, extremely respectable family, and the other the president of a rapidly growing railroad empire, acknowledged each other with a nod before Watson Sr. was suddenly up and out of his chair. As the other family members settled around the wide table beneath the 100-candle crystal-cut chandeliers, Watson Sr. went round the table and made a deep bow to Ophelia Eufaula. Her ravishing beauty consumed his senses and momentarily made him forget himself. "How do you do, Miss Hudson? Pleased to see you," he managed in a gruff, untempered whisper. Just an aside, Watson Sr. cannot speak well because he has damage to his mouth. So if you haven't read the story, that's why. Back to the story. His A's were always soft, like the pouring of wine. His T's were nearly unrecognizable and would get jumbled up amidst the other letters. Any other letter sounds came and went with no rhyme or reason. They were all rusty from disuse. The awkward sound of his voice was almost as surprising to him as it was to his amazed audience. It was the most he had said to anyone, especially anyone unfamiliar, in quite a long time. Ever since he had endured the injuries to his face, Watson Sr. could not form succinct or proper syllables. The shape of his mouth, with its permanently drawn-down edges, would only admit the barest forms of spoken language. These hindrances, in addition to the fact that he had never learned to read or write... 15 minutes is up, so I'm going to finish this paragraph. There we go. These hindrances, in addition to the fact that he had never learned to read or write, made him as unsuitable an oaf as Ophelia Eufaula had ever dreamed might dare to speak to her. She was stunned by his sudden appearance and awkward word sounds. Ophelia Eufaula stood silent as he recovered his bow and then pulled her high-backed, cherry-wood chair for her to sit. As she lightly picked up her delicately rustling satin skirts to settle herself in the chair, Watson Sr. heard her say, in a soft, melodic voice, barely above a whisper, but bristling with the cold edge of indignation, "Excuse me, am I supposed to know you?" Anyway, that's it for the reading for chapter 2. There's so much more, and there will be much, much more in 2023. So in the meantime, I just want to say happy holidays to everybody. I hope you watched the other video I put out today, all about the book in general. And I just wish everybody a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Bye-bye all.